Hello and welcome to WION Live broadcast from London. I'm Ollie Barrett, and in this bulletin we'll bring you updates on stories developing around the world, including the latest from Afghanistan. First, the headlines. And in Afghanistan, Taliban troops open fire on protesters in Jalalabad city, demanding the reinstallation of Afghanistan's flag were the protesters on offices instead of the Taliban's. Afghan women hold a street protest in Kabul as Taliban fighters look on. The Afghan embassy in Tajikistan removes Ashraf Ghani's portrait and replaces it with Amarullah Saleh's. He has declared himself president of Afghanistan after Ghani left the country.
We will judge this regime based on the choices it makes and by its actions rather than by its words.
The House of Commons here in London holds an emergency debate on the situation in Afghanistan. Boris Johnson says the UK should judge the Taliban based on its actions and not its words. More than 2,200 diplomats and other civilians have been evacuated from Afghanistan on military flights as efforts gather pace to get people out after the Taliban seized Kabul. Civilian flights remain suspended. An earthquake, a storm, floods, no relief in sight for the Caribbean island of Haiti as the death toll nears 2,000. Rescue teams resume a search for survivors. The Taliban's top political leader and co-founder Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar has returned to Afghanistan after over a decade. Baradar, who is the chief of the Taliban's political office, arrived in Kandahar along with a delegation. They disembarked from a C-17 aircraft at Kandahar airport. He arrived from Qatar, where he spent months leading talks with the United States and negotiators from the former Afghan government. Baradar helped his former commander in the anti-Soviet resistance movement establish the Taliban in the mid-1990s. He was arrested in 2010 in Pakistan and held for 8 years. He was released from prison with the agreement of former US President Donald Trump's administration so he could participate in peace talks. In 2020, Baradar became the first Taliban leader to communicate directly with the US president when he spoke with Donald Trump over the phone shortly after signing an initial agreement to end the conflict. With Kabul almost entirely in Taliban hands and President Ashraf Ghani having fled the country, Baradar has emerged as Afghanistan's new de facto leader. And after taking control of Afghanistan, the Taliban held its first news conference from inside the presidential palace. The media briefing was held at the Strategic Communication Office of the Advisors to the President. After landing in Kabul from Doha, top leaders from the Taliban sat facing the cameras. Taliban spokesman Zabihullah Mujahideen took questions from journalists on peace and women's rights.
The Taliban held their first official news conference in Kabul on Tuesday since the shocking, swift seizure of the city, claiming they wanted peaceful relations with other countries and, despite past harsh treatment of women that included public stonings, vowed they would respect women's rights within the framework of Islamic law.
Women will be afforded all their rights, whether it is in work or other activities, because women are a key part of society. And we are guaranteeing all their rights within the limits of Islam.
The militant group also said Afghans who had worked with the U.S. and allied forces as translators or in similar roles had a home within the new regime.
As for their talents and their skills, we do not want them to leave the country. We want them to serve their own homeland.
Locals gathered around television sets to watch the press conference, like these men in a Kabul pool hall.
I am worried and hope there will be peace, stability, and a good system in the country. There is a lot of anarchy in the current government, so let's see what the Taliban will do for us.
The Taliban's conciliatory tone contrasted sharply with comments by Afghan First Vice President Amrullah Saleh, who served under President Ashraf Ghani prior to Ghani fleeing the country. Saleh on Tuesday declared himself the, quote, legitimate caretaker president of Afghanistan and vowed that he would not bow to Kabul's new rulers. The Taliban news conference came as U.S. and Western allies rushed to evacuate diplomats and civilians from Afghanistan, one day after chaotic scenes at the Kabul airport of desperate Afghans trying to flee. The Taliban in their press conference said families trying to leave the country should return home and that nothing would happen to them. Some Kabul residents on Tuesday cautiously ventured back to work. Many shops were shuttered, schools closed, and traffic was light, but there were several pickup trucks with white flags carrying Taliban gunmen and commanders stationed at checkpoints.
WION's correspondent Anas Malik was also present at the press conference. He posed a question on Al-Qaeda and the leadership of Afghanistan.
One for the English press. What happens to your relation with Al-Qaeda? Are you willing to give that up, or are you willing to give an assurance on that, number one? And number two, who will be the leader?
One question.
It's a two-part question. So who will be the leader from the Taliban who can possibly be the face of Afghanistan now that in the absence of a leadership when President Ghani is not here? Thank you.
The first question about foreign fighters is that we will not allow any foreigners who wish to harm or threaten the security of other countries, any space in Afghanistan. And we have assured this. As for your second question, as for the government setup, we are still working on it, and hopefully we'll reach that stage soon.
Major logistical challenges and what could be a rapidly closing window are keeping the US administration from meeting its target to evacuate thousands more at-risk Afghans who worked for the US government. The Pentagon is aiming to evacuate 22,000 special immigrant visa applicants, their families and other vulnerable people. Officials and refugee resettlement groups say the target will be difficult to reach now the Taliban is in control. The hope is to fly out between 5,000 and 9,000 per day when the Pentagon reaches full capacity with 6,000 troops on the ground in Kabul. Only 4,000 have arrived so far.
The U.S. military restarted flights evacuating diplomats and civilians from Afghanistan on Tuesday, a day after chaotic scenes at Kabul airport, where thousands desperate to flee following the Taliban's sudden takeover had crowded the runway, which has since been cleared.
The speed of evacuation will pick up.
Army Major General William Taylor said the U.S. could evacuate 5,000 to 9,000 people from Kabul per day if conditions at the airport remain stable.
There have been discussions, there is communication.
And Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said U.S. military commanders were communicating with Taliban leaders to avoid hostilities at the airport, the only way to fly in or out of the country.
Just suffice it to say that our commanders there at the airport are charged with securing that airport and keeping it secure. And they will and should have whatever interactions they believe are necessary to accomplish that mission.
U.S. forces took charge of the airport on Sunday as the Taliban wrapped up a week of rapid advances by taking over Kabul without a fight. General Taylor said a total of 4,000 American troops would be at the airport by the end of the day, an increase of 1,000, with the aim of having one flight taking off per hour. U.S. military officials have said they believe that between 5,000 and 10,000 U.S. citizens remain in the Kabul area, where tens of thousands more Afghan citizens also wished to escape.
Tens of thousands of civilians in Afghanistan are living in fear as the Taliban take control. For Afghans living across the United States, the last few days have been full of panic and anxiety as they worry about the safety of their families back home. Many blame the United States for the crisis.
As American troops leave Afghanistan and the Taliban cements its control over the country, Afghans living in the U.S. fear for their family's safety back home.
Once the Taliban capture Kabul, Afghanistan, there is no future, no hope, no one feels safe.
35-year-old NAJIB KOHISTANI lives in Fremont, California. He's one of the roughly 156,000 Afghans now residing in the U.S. He says he thinks the U.S. should have finished what they started when they invaded Afghanistan 20 years ago.
They should stay until, the Taliban defeated completely. But the Taliban was like day by day, they were getting like stronger and stronger. They should stay. They should, defeat them like completely, then come back.
Many have clamored for Washington to take in more Afghans after the Taliban seized the capital, Kabul. Thousands of desperate civilians rushed to Kabul airport on Monday, prompting the U.S. to suspend evacuations. Some clung to a U.S. military plane as it taxied on the runway, according to local broadcaster Tolo News. AISHA WAHAB, the first Afghan-American woman to be elected to U.S. public office, called the withdrawal heartbreaking.
The sad fact of the matter is that there was no attempt for nation building. And even with these governments in place, the United States legitimized warlords of the previous decades in positions of power and gave them more authority and more control in the country. That right there started the catalyst to what we see today.
Facing criticism over the chaos, U.S. President Joe Biden on Monday defended the withdrawal of American troops, blaming the Taliban's takeover on Afghan leaders who fled the country and a U.S.-trained Afghan army unwilling to fight. The U.S.-based Afghan Council is trying to help Afghans file visa requests for their relatives still stuck in the country. But they say there's little else the organization can do.
Afghanistan is in the hands of the Taliban, so the international community will need to find a way to work with those sitting in Kabul. The European Union's begun the process. The EU's foreign policy chief says the bloc will work with the Taliban, even though it doesn't recognise the group. It'll come with conditions. EU foreign ministers have been meeting to discuss the security situation.
Having said that we are going to recognise the Taliban, I just said that we have to talk with them for everything, even to try to protect women and girls. Even for that, we have to get in touch with them. I haven't said that we are going to accept the Taliban, whatever they do. They said that we will put conditions for continuing our support, and we are going to use our leverage, all our leverage, in order to make the human rights to be respected.
The EU chief said that NATO invaded Afghanistan in 2001 to destroy Al-Qaeda, but the commitment shifted over the years. Its purpose became to construct a modern state and a land that respects human rights. The EU claims that after 20 years of being in the war-torn country, only the first part of that mission succeeded. The bloc's foreign policy chief has warned the Taliban to respect fundamental rights, especially for women and children, saying that only then can Brussels work with Kabul. G7 leaders are set to hold a virtual summit on the crisis in what London describes as the coming days. US President Joe Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson have discussed the security issue in the country. It was the first phone call between Biden and a foreign leader since the Taliban took Kabul. The European Union is speaking with the Taliban regarding the evacuation process as well. Not just European citizens, but also Afghans who've worked with NATO forces over the last 2 decades. This is bringing back memories of the 2015 Europe migration crisis. The The chaotic arrival of over 1 million people from West Asia overwhelmed security and welfare systems. Member states are nervous the current refugee influx could trigger similar scenes. So European countries are coming up with their own approach to the crisis. Britain has announced plans to relocate 20,000 Afghan refugees in the next 5 years. 5,000 will be resettled in the first year. Interior Minister Priti Patel says Britain is prioritising women, girls and religious minorities. The scheme is modelled on the plan that resettled refugees from the Syrian conflict from 2014 to this year. France is also vowing to protect those at risk. It says it will also put together robust action to thwart illegal migration. That brought criticism from some quarters for President Emmanuel Macron for the tone in which he spoke. Austria will conduct a thorough screening of Afghans seeking asylum, but the country also says it will deport Afghans who are rejected back to Kabul. Germany has suspended aid to Afghanistan and says it will attempt to help neighbouring countries who are facing an influx of civilians from Afghanistan. Describing the capture of Afghanistan by the Taliban as faster than expected, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that Britain would do everything it could to avert a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. He added that there is no appetite for military action in the country. Addressing Parliament, which was recalled to discuss the Afghanistan situation, Johnson ruled out an inquiry into British conduct in the nation, saying that most questions had already been looked into.
We'll be saying in just a few moments we will be supporting, doing everything we can to support those who have helped the UK mission in Afghanistan and investing everything that we can to support the wider area around Afghanistan and to do everything we can to avert a humanitarian crisis. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I spoke to Secretary General Stoltenberg the other day about NATO's continuing role in Afghanistan, but I really think that it is an illusion to believe that there is appetite amongst any of our partners for a continued military presence or for a military solution imposed by NATO in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker. That idea ended with the combat mission in 2014, and I do not believe that today, I do not believe that deploying tens of thousands of British troops to fight the Taliban is an option that, no matter how sincerely people may advocate it, and I appreciate their sincerity, but I do not believe that that is an option that would commend itself either to the British people or, Mr. Speaker, to this House.
Since taking control over Kabul, the Taliban have said they want peace and will not take revenge against old enemies. The group has also claimed that rights of women will be respected within the framework of Islamic law. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said in Parliament that the Taliban would be judged on their actions and not their words.
We will judge this regime based on the choices it makes and by its actions rather than by its words. On its attitude to terrorism, to crime and narcotics, as well as humanitarian access and the rights of girls to receive an education.
Away from Afghanistan, and Tropical Storm Grace ravaged Haiti on Tuesday, hampering rescue efforts as the country struggled to recover from an earthquake that killed nearly 2,000 people. Thousands have been shifted to makeshift camps to prevent further casualties. Hospitals on the island nation are overwhelmed.
The death toll from the major earthquake that struck Haiti last weekend surged to close to 2,000 on Tuesday, as the search for survivors resumed after Tropical Storm Grace hit overnight. Hospitals struggled to tend to all those injured, with many people still missing or under the rubble. Heavy rain fell over Lekai, the southern coastal city that bore the brunt of the 7.2 magnitude quake. Inside a tent city, hundreds of people scrambled to repair makeshift coverings made of wooden poles and tarps that were destroyed by Grace. Some took cover under plastic sheets.
The rain fell on top of us. We slept sitting down on chairs. Nobody has come to help us. We have no tarps. We sleep here sitting down. I don't want to go home. I am in God's hands.
It's not good here by the coast. My home was destroyed. I have nothing to use to sleep. Look, there's lots of children here. I really have nothing.
The storm complicated rescue efforts and made it difficult to provide aid and relief to hundreds of thousands left struggling for food, water, or shelter. According to Haitian authorities, with about 37,312 houses destroyed by the quake, and many of those still unexcavated, the death toll is expected to rise. Haiti's latest natural disaster comes just over a month after Haiti was plunged into political turmoil by the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse on July 7th.
In a Nigerian port, drones, helicopters and attack boats have been put on show as part of a US-backed initiative to tackle the situation in the world's largest piracy hotspot, the Gulf of Guinea. A more than 2.35 million square kilometre expanse of the Atlantic Ocean that borders some 20 West African nations is known as Pirate Alley. It's where nearly all the world's kidnappings at sea now take place, since the water off Somalia in East Africa has become more secure.
Helicopters hover overhead as speedboats race through the water. This equipment, put on show in Nigeria's Apapa port, is to be deployed against piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. It's part of the $195 million US-backed Deep Blue initiative, which aims to stem a rising tide of attacks and kidnappings in the most dangerous place on Earth for seafarers. According to the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency, Deep Blue is working and stemmed kidnappings in the Gulf of Guinea in the second quarter. That's after a record 130 sailors were abducted in 2020, compared with just 5 across the rest of the world. But there have already been 50 kidnappings recorded this year. Earlier this month, the USS Herschel Woody Williams docked in Nigeria to train regional security forces to use their new kit. Claire Pierangelo is the US Consul General in Nigeria.
Maritime security is not just the obligation of one nation. It takes cooperative efforts to achieve it. We continue to encourage strong domestic efforts that will integrate the existing regional structures to counter this growing threat of piracy in the Gulf of Guinea.
According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, 38% of all hostages taken in the Gulf of Guinea in 2015 were foreign nationals, but that rose to 89% in 2020. And experts say it's going to take more than expensive hardware to fix the problem. The Gulf, also known as Pirate Alley, covers more than 900,000 square miles bordering countries from Senegal to Angola. But nearly all of the region's pirates originate from Nigeria's oil-rich but impoverished Niger Delta.
We also have some concerns, obviously, with Deep Blue.
Jacob Larson is the head of maritime and cybersecurity at Shipowner Association, BIMCO.
Development in the region is slower than elsewhere. The economy is lacking compared to the huge potential this region has in terms of raw materials and so on. It basically has a really negative impact for the region as a whole.
As international and local firms churn out Nigeria's oil, pollution in the Niger Delta means many people cannot farm or fish. And according to the United Nations, 70% of its roughly 30 million people earn less than $1 a day. UNODC estimates that Delta-based pirates netted $4 million in ransom payments in 2020. Due to the large sums involved, some kingpins are well connected, UNODC found, and there's concern about collusion by security forces. Earlier this year, Nigeria's Navy said it would strengthen measures to root out personnel who collaborate with kidnappers and criminals.
And that is all we have on today's WION Live broadcast from London. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. And for more global news and updates, stay tuned to WION World is One.
Many other